Hi, everyone. It's Alicia here to let you know about some of the exciting things that we've got stewing over here at the podcast. We have so many exciting guests lined up for this winter, and we're really excited about that. We're really so grateful to all of you for being part of our community, for rating us, for sharing us with your friends, for listening, really. And we'd really love to connect more with you. So to that end, we are getting our social media game together. For now, you can follow us on Twitter at JewishIdeas_pod, and more platforms will be coming at you soon. On a different note, here at the podcast, we do everything we can to make sure that the ideas really stay the star of the show. So we're releasing today's episode even though the audio is a little bit damaged, because we really learned so much recording it and we think that you'll enjoy it quite a bit. So we hope you do.
Greetings, friends, and welcome back to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motion podcast. I'm JJ Kimchi. Here at the podcast of Jewish Ideas, we are engaging in a three-part series on the life and thought of Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra, one of medieval Judaism's most fascinating and accomplished individuals. A brilliant scientist, philosopher, biblical commentator, polemicist, and poet, Ibn Ezra's writings continue to be read and celebrated by all who take any interest in the religious and intellectual history of the Jewish people. On today's episode, we will be diving into Ibn Ezra's commentary on the Torah, a widely acknowledged masterpiece of intellectual prowess, spiritual sensitivity, and sharp textual analysis. This Pirush has become Ibn Ezra's most enduring work and remains one of the most intensely studied and widely quoted of all the thousands of Torah commentaries over the past 2 millennia. Joining us today to discuss Ibn Ezra's commentary on the Torah is Dr. Sara Labaton, who serves as the Director of Teaching and Learning at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. Dr. Labaton wrote her PhD at NYU on the subject of Abraham Ibn Ezra's commentary on the Torah and has since taught the Hebrew Bible and its exegesis at various educational institutions around the Jewish world. It is a pleasure to welcome her to the podcast of Jewish Ideas today. Dr. Labaton, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Excellent. So let's dive in and take a look at this magnificent work, Ibn Ezra's Pirush al Torah. So to begin with, let's map the Pirush a little bit onto Ibn Ezra and specifically his life story, because he traveled a lot and he was in a lot of different places. So what were the personal circumstances of Ibn Ezra writing his this particular composition? Where did he compose it? What were the circumstances? Why do we have different versions of it? If you could run us through a little bit the Pirush on the background of Ibn Ezra's life.
Sure. Ibn Ezra was born towards the end of the 11th century. Scholars debate the exact date, 1089, 1092, in Spain, in Tudela. And see, it's only at the age of 50 that he leaves Spain and moved to Latin Europe. And it's unclear why. It's possible that it had to do with the imminent Almohad invasion. It's also possible that it was poverty that caused him to move. In one of his famous poems, he laments that he is always unlucky, that if he was a shroud maker, nobody would die. If he was a candle maker, the sun would never set. So it's also possible that it was his financial circumstances or turbulent personal life that really caused him to leave Muslim Spain. In Muslim Spain, he was a poet. He wrote secular poetry and religious poetry, and it was only when he got to Latin Europe, he landed in Rome, that he started writing commentaries on the Bible, as well as other works. So works on Hebrew grammar, scientific work, theological works. And critically, he is writing in Hebrew. He's not writing in Arabic. Like you said, he moved around a lot. He moved from Rome to Lucca. He moved to Provence, to northern France. And then he dies in England. Now, the fact that he is peripatetic, that he is moving around, that he's somewhat of a nomad, is actually quite significant. For one thing, it impacts his work, that he seems to encounter different ideas and different audiences, and that ends up shaping what he's actually doing in his exegesis. It's also the case that he is writing for patrons. So that's one of the reasons why he writes, for example, two versions of, let's say, his commentary on Megillat Esther. He writes one complete commentary on the Pentateuch, a Sefer HaYashar, that's sometimes called his short commentary. And then when he moved to France, he never seems to complete it, but he writes another commentary on the book of Genesis. And then he writes what is considered, or what is called, the long commentary on the book of Exodus. And he's writing because he gets paid to write. I would also say that it is his position as a diffuser of knowledge among the Jews of Latin Europe that is also noteworthy and relevant. That it's the fact that he traveled around is what allows him to diffuse all of this knowledge, and it probably contributes to him becoming so well known and so influential. By the way, there's evidence that some of his scientific treatises get translated into Latin, so it's possible that he has Christian students as well. And I guess I would just end by saying that he's a really important cultural broker, certainly in the Jewish world, and it seems that that's how he sees himself, as a mediator of Greco-Arabic knowledge, the Gaonic Andalusian um, um, modes of learning. He wants to bring that to the Jews of Latin Europe. And that seems to be part of his project. I think it is a little bit more complicated, and hopefully we'll get into that.
Interesting. So that's a good segue into exactly what I wanted to ask, because of course, so he is writing this in the 12th century, but of course, nobody, and certainly not Ibn Ezra, is writing in an intellectual vacuum. So he is writing on the back of several traditions. Right? He's writing his Pirush on the Torah on the back of several traditions. One of them is, of course, the Gaonic tradition of studying the Torah. And the other one is the Andalusian tradition. There are other figures in southern Spain who are in Muslim Spain who are writing as well. So could you perhaps talk us a little bit through this, meaning what did the intellectual backdrop, and specifically commentary on the Torah, what did the commentator backdrop, as it were, for Ibn Ezra, and how did he see himself as a continuer or as an innovator within this intellectual scene?
Great. So there's one important piece which I think you left out, and that is Latin Europe, and that is going to significantly shape his project. And I think he is profoundly influenced by what is happening around him. But you're absolutely right that he draws very heavily on his Andalusian predecessors, and he quotes them extensively, specifically in the context of fields like grammar and philology and poetics and his literary aesthetic sensibilities. So people like Moshe Ibn Ezra does not think that there is a relation between them, but he is quoting him, and Ibn Jikatila and Ibn Bal'am. He's quoting all of these luminaries from Al-Andalus. And he is also certainly indebted to the Gaonic heritage, which came before the Andalusian heritage. In other words, people like Saadia Gaon, Shmuel Ben Chotni Gaon, their accomplishments and their achievements in the realm of exegesis and grammar and philology and theology, they paved the way for what happened in Andalusia. I think specifically Saadia Gaon is an important person to focus on, because Ibn Ezra said that Saadia Gaon is the first speaker on all matters. Even though he occasionally vehemently disagrees with Saadia, the fact is that Ibn Ezra sees Saadia as critically important. And I think what's so relevant about Saadia is Saadia was the first, number one, to integrate all of these fields in biblical exegesis. So he is integrating grammar and philology and theology into his exegesis and translation, the tafsir, into Arabic. So that is one really relevant piece, of data about Saadia, even though he's not the first one to do any of these things, but he's the first one to really integrate it into a systematic, coherent model of biblical exegesis. And the reason why that's relevant is that Saadia, the way that Saadia sees his work is He is trying to put forward a philologically sound and rational commentary on the Torah. He says, I am going to interpret the Torah according to its obvious, apparent, some might say, literal meaning, except in a few cases. When the obvious, apparent meaning of the Torah conflicts with reason or sensory knowledge or tradition or another verse, then he's going to introduce non-literal interpretation. Now, Saadia and Ibn Ezra follows that model in very meaningful ways. Saadia, however, draws heavily on Quranic exegesis. Saadia does not use the term Pshat or Pshuto Shel Mikra. He does not introduce the dichotomy between Pshat and Drash. He does not use the Talmudic maxim, Ein Mikra Yotzei Midei Pshuto, that a verse does not leave the realm of its Pshat. Shmuel ben Chofi Gaon introduces that nomenclature. Saadia does not. Saadia is really rooted in Quranic exegesis and in Islamic learning, and he's using that language to guide him. I guess I would also say one last thing about Saadia, which is that what causes him to innovate, what causes him to become this pioneer of philologically oriented Bible commentary really seems to be the threat of Karaism and Karaites. The Karaites are doing something really similar, and it would seem to be that Saadia wants to produce something that even exceeds what the Karaites are doing, and simultaneously, he wants to make sure to affirm the commitment, his commitment and the Gaonic commitment to halakha, to tradition, to the oral law, to the Talmud. So I would say that those are heavy influences for Ibn Ezra. The place where Ibn Ezra meaningfully diverges is that he identified this philological based exegesis with Pshuto Shel Mikra, with the terminology of Pshat. And he, in some ways, is really the first one to do that and to make the argument that Pshat represents the single meaning of the biblical text. And why does he do that? I'll make one last comment. Why is he so taken with the terminology of Pshat? It seems because when he gets to Latin Europe, Rashi's commentaries are overwhelmingly popular. Everybody is, that's the in thing. Pshat is trending in Latin Europe. And it would appear that that is why Ibn Ezra takes this modality of exegesis that he got from his Andalusian predecessors, from his Gaonic predecessors, and marries it with the terminology of Pshuto Shel Mikra, or Pshat.
Fascinating. And this goes to what you were saying before, of course, which is that Ibn Ezra is one of the few people who traveled few intellectuals who traveled truly extensively during that time, and therefore I suppose his methodology can be seen to be nourished from both places.
Absolutely. And I think even if you look at some of the distinctions between, let's say, his short commentary and his long commentary, some have argued that his long commentary, which was written later, might bear the imprint of some of the mystical ideas that were percolating in Latin Europe at that time. Certainly possible. I hadn't investigated that extensively, but it would seem that even some of those differences. Yeah.
Fascinating. So Ibn Ezra wasn't just a courier, but he wasn't just bringing new ideas and information and trends and posts to these various places. He was also taking them in. He was imbibing from these places.
Absolutely. I don't think he's not going to acknowledge that, but I think that is the case. Yes.
Fascinating.
He actually, he is somewhat condescending when it comes to the Jews of Latin Europe and their intellectual endeavors.
Yes, there's one wonderful poetic exchange between him and I think the Rashbam, right?
Yeah.
Where the Rashbam tries to write poetry to Ibn Ezra, and Ibn Ezra says, "What are you doing? You Ashkenazi, you don't know the first thing about Hebrew verse."
I think it's Rabbeinu Tam. I thought it was Rabbeinu Tam, but maybe, who knows? Yeah.
One of those bilaters. Yeah, exactly.
Yes, and by the way, it seems that the Balei Atosfot did not give him that much honor or respect. And the truth is that he wasn't a Talmudist. He was not well, and sometimes he even misquotes the Talmud. So that might be one reason for it.
Interesting. Okay, so let's go. I mean, I'm about to ask you something, perhaps of an unfair question, because it's so big and so broad. But it's the basic question, which is, what does Ibn Ezra seek to do in his commentary? What are the basic things that what are the main goals of it, and how does he seek to accomplish it? Can one sum up his methodology or his aims, relatively quickly?
Definitely not relatively quickly.
Right. Okay.
And I think, I think this is also maybe a function of his traveling and just his output, that it's really hard to put Ibn Ezra into a box. And there are a lot of just tensions and contradictions in his work. And I think that sometimes he almost feels like a blank canvas, and everybody who's trying to decipher him or to make sense out of him projects their own interests onto him. So I would say that I'll tell you what I think the certain scholars would say about Ibn Ezra's goal, and then I'll tell you where I diverge a little bit. So scholars like Uriel Simon and Mordechai Cohen, who was one of my professors, and who I deeply, deeply respect, they would say that Ibn Ezra is best understood as the quintessential Pashtan, that he brings Pshat exegesis to, it's the highest level it had, up until then. And the reason that they say that is in contrast to somebody like Ibn Jannah in Spain, or Rashi and Rashbam in northern France, who had a dual hermeneutic, whereby they say there is the Pshat and the linguistic, grammatical, philological meaning of the text is has integrity. It is significant. It stands on its own. And then there is also another realm of interpretation, which is midrash. Rashbam goes so far as to say that midrash is what is essential. That is paramount. And the only reason that Rashbam says he's doing pshat, is because it has been neglected up until then. That's the dual hermeneutic. Ibn Ezra, at least according to Mordechai Cohen and Uriel Simon, transforms pshat into a single hermeneutic. That the derech ha-pshat, the way of pshat, is meant to uncover the exclusive, single, original meaning of the biblical text. That Ibn Ezra is going to marshal grammar and reason and philology and all of the and poetics in order, and he's going to bring those disciplines to bear in order to uncover that one singular meaning. And he firmly says as much in various places in his commentary, that he is motivated by this derech hapshat. He had two introductions to a commentary, one in his Sefer HaYashar, his first complete commentary, and one in the introduction to Genesis. And he does the same thing in both, although he writes them differently. He lays out 5 methodologies for studying Torah: the Gaonic methodology, the Karaite methodology, the Christian methodology, and then the Midrashic methodology. And he contrasts all of those with his own, with a derech hapshat. However, I think the story is a little bit more complicated, because there is also this very strong undercurrent of esotericism in Ibn Ezra's commentaries, what we call sod, secret. And it would seem to be that constitutes its own layer of exegesis, that it's not consistent the way that the Pshat is. It doesn't run through the entire text. It's not like these are, two parallel realities, textual realities running simultaneously. But in certain places in the biblical text, it seems that the text is speaking to an enlightened reader, and that there are recesses, not just of deeper meanings, but of actually like subversive theological meanings. And that is intended for an enlightened reader, for the maskil. And in those places, Ibn Ezra will allude to a different interpretation. And I would say more generally that, and Ibn Ezra talks about this in both introductions, and he'll say that there are places in the Torah, for example, the Eight Hada'at, where you have Pshat and you have Sod, and they coexist. They are joined together like bodies and souls. And he'll say there are sometimes where the Pshat is actually really problematic. And here he's drawing from Sa'adia, where the Pshat simply cannot stand on its own. And in those cases, it is necessary to turn towards Sod, towards this esoteric mode of interpretation. So I don't think that Pshat I don't think we can say that Pshat, the Derech HaPshat, represents the single, exclusive, original meaning of the text. I think that there are places where, in his commentary, where Ibn Ezra turns to Sod. And by the way, there are places, and he says this explicitly, when the Pshat contradicts the halakha, the rabbinic normative meaning of the text, when it comes to law and behavior and practice, then the Derech HaPshat has to move away, that the halakha actually takes precedence. So I think when he names all of these modes of interpretation, and of course it goes back to his travels, and he's encountering so many different modes of interpretation, he's not just rejecting them absolutely. He stands by his own method of interpretation, but he is carefully, subtly incorporating other modes of interpretation, even Christian modes, even, which is the esoteric, that's where he situates his comments on Sod, or certainly the midrashic and the halachic modes of exegesis, and the geonic or midrashic modes of exegesis. And I'll just say one final thing about this. He compares this all to a circle. And he talked about the center of the circle. And we would expect that the center of the circle is the Derech HaPshat, or based on what Mordechai Cohen and Uriel Simon posit, that the Derech HaPshat is the one single original meaning of the biblical text. That's what we would expect. But no, the middle of the circle is emet. It is truth. And I think that and he described the Derech HaPshat with the more subjective phrase, it is Yeshara Be'enai. It seems right to me. But I think that for Ibn Ezra, emet, truth, is something which required the coordination, the careful coordination of many modes of exegesis. And he also talks about being on a path towards truth. I'm not sure that he thinks that anybody can ever fully converge on that dot in the middle of the circle when they are interpreting the biblical text.
Interesting. I'd like to drill down a little bit in this notion of pshat, especially with Ibn Ezra, because of course other Mepharshim at the time, such as Rashbam, such as Rashi, others also certainly pay lip service, at the very least, to the idea of pshat and the idea of what might be called the plain text meaning. And so I want to know, are there discernible differences? Is there a specific Ibn Ezra mode of getting to the pshat, especially because, for those who are familiar with learning Rashi, for instance, Rashi seems to think that getting to the Pshat will often require the aid of rabbinic midrash, for instance. Ibn Ezra seems to be less inclined in that direction, although he's not a stranger to midrash at all. So Ibn Ezra certainly does chase Pshat, but is there a discernible Ibn Ezra form of Pshat or style of Pshat that we can see in his Pirush?
Absolutely. First of all, I think the best comparison is really between Ibn Ezra and Rashbam. I think, you can even make some interesting comparisons between Rashi and his grandson, Rashbam. Rashbam talks about this, how in Genesis, I think 37, where he says sometimes, my grandfather pioneered this modality of Pshat, but sometimes I told him that he got it wrong. And my grandfather said if only he had time, he would rewrite his commentaries. And it seems that Rashi does that. So there is certainly kind of an exegetical revolution that is building in the northern French yeshivot. And Rashi and Rashbam Rashi found that, and Rashbam is a critical link in that. And I think Rashi, it's a great question for another time of whether Rashi, really what his program is, in fact, because I think the conventional read is that Rashi falls short in Pshat when it comes to Pshat. If you read Mordechai Cohen's book, The Rule of Pshat, he makes a really compelling argument that if we understand what Rashi is setting out to do, he actually accomplishes it. His Pshat adheres to his exegetical program. I would say that for Ibn Ezra and Rashbam, who are contemporaries, Ibn Ezra's Pshat is different. Number one, because he has just so much by way of Hebrew grammar and poetics and philology that the Rashbam just did not have. And Ibn Ezra learned that in a Muslim milieu where there is comparative linguistics. And Ibn Ezra is coming just with a very different toolbox. The other thing that I would say is, maybe it's ironic, but because Rashbam has this dual hermeneutic where he is comfortable saying, number one, Pshat is secondary. It is the halakha, it is midrash, which is primary, and he's just coming to Sila Lacuna. Because of that, Rashbam's Pshat is sometimes much more radical than Ibn Ezra's, because Ibn Ezra is constrained by the rabbinic tradition. Remember, Ibn Ezra said the rabbis knew Pshat. He claims not to be innovating anything. So he is, and he's really trying to make the Pshat and the Drash converge. He's trying to make them consonant in a way that Rashbam is not. So, for example, let's say in the context of their interpretations of tefillin, of phylacteries, Rashbam, in the context of tefillin, Rashbam interprets tefillin in Exodus metaphorically. It is a symbol. And Ibn Ezra says, even though Rashbam adduced very compelling literary analyses to support that, Ibn Ezra says, how could you say that? There's something heretical and antinomian about that. If you say that, people are going to stop wearing tefillin. He doesn't say that explicitly, but I imagine that is what is going through his head.
Interesting. And of course, this difference between Ibn Ezra and Rashbam, at least according to some, is the story behind Ibn Ezra's final composition, the Igeret HaShabbat, where he writes a letter defending Shabbat against seemingly the quote-unquote attack by other scholars. And one theory is that it's referring to the Rashbam who believes that Shabbos, at least according to Pshat, Shabbat ought to start in the morning and not on Friday night. And Ibn Ezra writes this great polemic against that idea and tries to save the Shabbat, as it were.
That's right. So it's, even though Ibn Ezra is so aggressive when it comes and militant when it comes to Pshat, at the end of the day, that ends up constraining him. And it ends up kind of forcing him to offer a Pshat that he probably didn't fully believe in himself.
Interesting. Let's turn to the other term that you use, which is of course sod, right? So sod meaning carrying the connotations both of foundation and of secret, as an important word used by many. What's interesting is that sod is used certainly by many in the medieval period, but of course each person had their own idea of what sod is and what the secret happens to be. So, for example, Kabbalists have their own version of sod, and Rambam has his idea of sod as being some kind of philosophical or metaphysical doctrines, the physics and metaphysics of Aristotle, as it were. And so I suppose Ibn Ezra is also, he is an esoteric writer. He does believe there is an esoteric course. So I suppose the question is, firstly, what did he believe the sod was? And why did he, or what was his theory as to how the Torah disclosed but also hid the secret at its core?
Yeah, I mean, that's $1 million question. And it's not, and it's, by the way, I'll say, some scholars would argue, like Moshe Halbertal, that Ibn Ezra's commentary really represents the watershed moment in the history of Jewish esotericism, and that Ibn Ezra is the one who really paved the way for later esotericists. So I guess to your first question, what is the sod? There's not one sod. I think that that's important. Some of it is very much astrological or astral magic in nature. Some of it is more metaphysical, mystical, has to do with the names of God and numerological analyses of the names of God, or cosmological. Some of it is about these post-Mosaic interpolations of verses that, again, at least according to Spinoza and later thinkers, that Moshe didn't actually write because it just doesn't make sense contextually. So I think it is almost it is a bucket, and Ibn Ezra uses it for different purposes. Sometimes it seems that Ibn Ezra does not, and this is best described as social or political esotericism, where he is afraid either of being attacked or critiqued, or he'll say in one place, mocked. And that's why he's not explicit about the sod. He says that, for example, in the context of his interpretation of the priestly garment. And I think that there is an argument to be made that Ibn Ezra is not just a social esotericist. He's not just worried about his own reputation or about collecting the youth, so to speak. It's not just about that. But what my teacher, Elliot Wolfson, the terminology that I learned from him, he's also an ontological esotericist, in the sense that there are certain ideas that are so ineffable, they're so incommunicable, that they need to stay secret, that you can never fully disclose or describe or explicate them. So I think Ibn Ezra is straddling both of those forms of esotericism, and it really depends on the particular secret. He certainly seems to envision a double readership. Like I said earlier, it's almost a double text, where one layer of the Torah is really meant for everybody. It's meant to be accessible to everybody. It's meant for the common person. And then there are points in the Torah when it comes to topics like the names of God or the world to come, where just deeper knowledge about metaphysics or science is required in order to penetrate that. And those are the places where Ibn Ezra will write esoterically. He'll use hints or contradictions, or he'll scatter his comments and tell the reader, you have to look at a different place in order to really put together the entire secret. So I think he's somewhat elusive, characteristically.
As one should be if you're talking about sod.
Exactly. And people don't agree what he actually meant. There's this whole burgeoning crop of super commentaries, on a commentary, especially in the 14th century in the Mediterranean basin, that emerges. And really, one of their main goals is trying to piece together his sod, what he actually meant, in these places where he takes this, where he swerves from the straightforward linguistic, grammatical, contextual mode of interpretation.
Interesting. And just, because I'm very curious and I can't not ask such a question, you already mentioned Ibn Ezra's most infamous case of the sod that he applies, which is the sod Hashneim Asar, which he applies to a few psukim, including the very first pasuk of Sefer Dvarim, where where the book says it's written Be'eve HaYarden, which of course implies that the vantage point of the original writer was in Eretz Israel, not outside Eretz Israel. And Ibn Ezra brings a couple of possibilities, and then he says, this is the Sola Shnei Masav, Maskil Yidom, and sort of leaves it there. And later, commentators, including Spinoza and others, have said, this is Ibn Ezra hinting to the fact that some of the verses in the Torah might have been written later on, weren't written by Moshe, might have been written, later centuries already in Eretz Israel. But of course, it can't be proven that that's what Ibn Ezra meant. I mean, he left it very blank and secret. And I'm just curious as to your personal theory. What do you think is the Sod he's referring to? Is that a correct reading of Ibn Ezra, or did he mean something possibly completely different? And this, they're barking up the wrong tree.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating line of inquiry, and I'll just say, it's not just the question of what did he mean that's so interesting to me, but it's how it was received. So I once read, and I was never able to track down the reference, that the Shadal actually refers to Ibn Ezra's commentaries as pig-like because they look kosher on the outside, but they are treif on the inside. And I also heard about a very well-known Rosh Yeshiva who once said, when he was asked about Ibn Ezra, he said he was a shtickle kother. I think I got that right. He had a little bit of heresy in him. I think that, in some ways, I don't know if it matters almost what his original intention is. I find that reading compelling, that he saw these verses as later interpolation. He was such a critical reader of text that, of course, it makes sense that these verses jumped out at him as verses the one from Genesis, Vaknani Az Ba'aretz, and the Canaanites were then in the land. And he's reading and he's like, wait a second, that could not have been written by Moshe. That must have been written later on and retroadjusted back in. I think that I do think that there is an interesting context for Ibn Ezra saying these things. We're so familiar with this, that, like you said, so infamous, that I think we sometimes forget that there is an exegetical context. So, for example, Yeset Ben Ali, who is a Karaite exegete living in Jerusalem, who Ibn Ezra cites extensively, Yeset has this idea of the narrator, and or the editor and narrator, and he clearly sees Moshe as shaping the form, or I shouldn't say clearly. He seems to see Moshe, the character of Moshe, as shaping the form of the Pentateuch. He does not see Moshe as a kind of passive, vessel through which God gives, the Torah, and it just comes out in the same way that it went in. And similarly, Saadia and Ibn Ezra both say that God does not give verbal revelation, that when God reveals God's self, God is revealing ideas and images, but it's up to the prophet to really determine how those ideas get expressed. So I think that, with the exception of the Ten Commandments, Ibn Ezra is pretty careful to say that, but that's how he explains the discrepancies between Exodus and Deuteronomy in the context of the Ten Commandments. So I think that once you're sort of thinking along those lines about an editor, a narrator, I think it's Ibn Chikatila who says that some of the Mizmorim of Tehillim, some of the Psalms were clearly not written by King David just because of the historical context. Once you're kind of in that environment of ideas, I don't think it's not such a far-fetched place to go to say that, and some of the verses might have been inserted later on. So, and I think it's I guess just from the point of view of a 21st century Jew, I think it's a blessing for us that Ibn Ezra seems to have pioneered this critical reading of sacred text, that he's a model of somebody who is able to actually hold both. But that's my own personal take.
In other words, you'd rather be walking in the footsteps of Ibn Ezra than Spinoza.
There you
That
go.
feels better. Right, exactly. That's perfectly legitimate. I sympathize with that a lot. So very briefly, I mean, one of the facets of your research, in which you explored this difference between Pshat and Sod and how Ibn Ezra applies it, is with regards to the Mishkan, the tabernacle as it's described in the book of Exodus and then the book of Leviticus. So I'm curious, could you perhaps give us a couple of minutes on that? Elaborate. Why is this an excellent test case, and what does the construction of the Mishkan and how Ibn Ezra reads it and how he understands it, how does this exemplify his approach both on the surface level and on the esoteric?
Sure. So Ibn Ezra seems to see the Mishkan as as constructed according to the dictates of astral magic, and by which I mean that was in field of, I don't know that it was science, even though astrology is certainly a branch of science for Ibn Ezra and for many of his contemporaries and predecessors. Astral magic, let me start again with that. Okay, so Ibn Ezra, we should just start by acknowledging that Ibn Ezra believes in astrology. He writes 14 volumes on astrology. It's not necessarily the case that his astrological research is original and innovative or groundbreaking, but he is certainly steeped in this discipline. He's also seems to have been very compelled by the field of astral magic. Now, the field of astral magic, which he certainly absorbed from the Islamic cultural milieu, was a field which posited that you could create certain objects that would draw down the emanations, the ruhaniyat, that were inhering within the celestial sphere. And if you created an object or a talisman made out of certain material, and if you recited certain incantations and performed certain rituals, that would attract and harness and draw down the ruhaniyat, these emanations, into the terrestrial realm. And that it seems that is how Ibn Ezra envisions not just the tabernacle, the materials of the tabernacle. By the way, specific materials, is a really integral part of astral magic. But it also seems to have been the way that he envisioned just the rituals that are performed within the tabernacle, later on in the temple. He seems to see, so for example, the placement of the vessels of something like the menorah, the incense altar, and the shulchan, that their exact placement is meant to replicate the spheres, the planetary spheres, the zodiacal spheres, and then the upper spheres, and that they were meant to draw down these emanations and facilitate prophecy or protect the people. They're meant to be talismanic in a certain way. And this actually penetrates literally the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So that's how he understands the Aron, the Ark, and the Kruvim, that these are meant to draw down the emanations that inhere within, the divine throne itself, the intellect, to use Neoplatonic terminology. And, this is Ibn Ezra's way of integrating an external modality or an external field of knowledge into the inner sanctums of the tradition. That's how he does it. And that's one of the functions of esotericism, that he finds a way of taking something external and internalizing it or baking it into the tradition. And he does that with the Mishkan.
And so, in that case, I suppose, if you might call it the Sod is something very much like using the Mishkan as a conduit for what you might call it understanding, intellectual excellence, this is sounding quite Maimonidean in that way, using the physical, the commandments of doing something physical, but ultimately for the goal of apprehending something or committing something to knowledge. Is this an accurate description? Is that what Ibn Ezra understands the Sod in the Mishkan?
Yeah, I mean, I would be worried about comparing Maimonides and Ibn Ezra in this particular,
because he comes before
right?
Maimonides,
But
yes.
and there's some interesting scholarship about whether or not Maimonides did ever read Ibn Ezra or not. But I think Maimonides would have been aghast at the idea of interpreting the Mishkan in astrological or magic astral terms. That would have been a real problem for Maimonides. Yes, I think that this is very much an intellectual exercise for Ibn Ezra, and I also wonder if this is a way of signaling to some of his readers that they should go out and actually learn these disciplines, that his readership, especially in Latin Europe, they may have been intrigued by fields like astrology and medieval Hebrew science and astronomy and astral magic, but they may not have been completely familiar with them. So I think this is also a way of Ibn Ezra sending them out to study these fields a little bit more intensively. And I would also, one question that I always had was whether Ibn Ezra chooses rituals like the Mishkan and like korbanot, sacrifice, or another example of this is the copper snake that heals in the Book of Numbers. Does Ibn Ezra do this because none of these are operative in their own context? So in other words, I'm not sure Ibn Ezra actually wants people to go out and do astral magic per se, but I think he wants them to know about the dictates and the principles of astral magic, that there are forces, that there are these celestial and stellar and supernal forces which deeply impact the terrestrial world. The other really interesting thing that Ibn Ezra brings to this Sod HaMishkan actually has nothing to do with the Mishkan, but rather has to do with the Beit HaMikdash, where he talks about not just the land of Israel, and he talked extensively about the inherent qualities, climatologically or geographically about the land of Israel, but the very place that the Beit HaMikdash is situated, Ibn Ezra argues has a special constitution that makes it especially receptive to attracting and absorbing the emanation from above. So, it's something interesting to think about in this way. He's very similar to Yehuda Halevi, who has similar theories about the land of Israel, that that the position of the temple was intentional, that it couldn't have been just anywhere, that it was situated in a place that would optimally attract the most supernal emanations. And, this is a place where on the one hand, you say astral magic and it feels like the most obscure antiquarian thing you could possibly imagine, except that today, I think that when we think about the Temple Mount and when we think about the land of Israel, that these ideas have actually maintained their currency and that have, maybe not directly, but indirectly, the assigning mystical significance to the land or to the place where the Beit HaMikdash was located, it actually had today political ramifications that, of course, somebody like Ibn Ezra could never have imagined.
Right, naturally. Okay, I mean, you've mentioned the astrology and the astral magic, and this is something I also wanted to ask a little bit about, which is, we've covered in a previous episode Ibn Ezra's, some of his philosophy, some of his science, some of his general worldviews. How much does that appear in his commentary on the Torah? Because there are some commentators who really marry uh, all their external knowledge, everything they know, with their pirush. There's some scholars who seem to keep it entirely separate, and Torah commentary, and their other interests are their other interests. And so, where does Ibn Ezra fall on this spectrum? And I suppose, how much science and philosophy of the medieval period do you need to know in order to truly get Ibn Ezra's pirush?
Yeah. So that's actually why he critiques the Geonim, because he sees the Geonim as having incorporated like all the scientific knowledge that they had and dumped it into this biblical text. And that's where he feels that it's extraneous and it's unwieldy. At the same time, he does bring scientific information to his commentary. And I think that there are some places where he does it because it's necessary to resolve an exegetical question. And that is the clear motivation for adducing any type of science, whether it's mathematics or astrology or astronomy or astromagic. He's motivated by a problem in the biblical text. And that distinguishes him from the Gaonim, that he is very careful and strategic about how he is using science. And in those places, I think you could make the argument that science is part of the Pshat, part of his Derech HaPshat, because he is using it clearly, explicitly, and strategically to resolve a problem of exegesis. And Shlomo Sella, has written extensively about this. I think that there are other places, however, where he is motivated by a different class of problems. He's motivated by a more metaphysical, a philosophical problem. And that's when he introduces science or metaphysics much more esoterically, where it's not a textual problem, so to speak. There's something about the biblical text that is gnawing at him, that is in tension with philosophy or with metaphysics. And that's where he feels the need to bring something in to resolve this tension between the revelation or the revealed layer of the Torah and what Ibn Ezra thinks to be true.
Interesting. We mentioned the scientific and philosophical side, and that's of course very important. But another side of Ibn Ezra that we haven't really covered much is the poetic side.
Yeah.
And he wrote some extraordinary, brilliant poetry, both secular and religious kinds of poetry, which I highly recommend anyone who can get their hands on it. It's thoroughly enjoyable, and of course, much of his poetry we actually sing on Shabbat and in the liturgy, etc. And I'm also curious as to how much of his commentary you see that. In other words, is there a touch of the poet within Ibn Ezra's commentary? So, I mean, there are other, again, just to compare to sort of other Pirushim, there are some who are exquisitely aware of, let's say, aesthetic and literary facets of the text, and others for whom this didn't really crop up on the radar screen because they themselves weren't particularly accomplished poets, and they didn't really have that chush, that sensibility. So again, reading through Ibn Ezra's Pirush Torah, do you get the sense that this is there aesthetic sensitivity there, and how much is it present?
Absolutely. I think, for starters, Ibn Ezra writes these two extraordinary introductions in rhyme to prose, and they are long,
yes,
and they are different from each other. So that is just one note, that there are places in his commentary where he's actually poetic. The other thing that I would note is that it's not just that he has these, like you said, the exquisite literary sensitivities, but it actually impacts his way of reading the text. So For example, when he said something like "Hibrat Harat Shon Bnei Adam," where he rejects the principle that the Torah speaks in the language of human beings, that the Torah he rejects this idea of omnisignificance, that every repetition or every jot and tittle of the biblical text can be interpreted and can be bound with meaning and different sets of meaning. He rejects that. And I think that's partially due to his literary sensitivity, that he knows that what good literature looks like. And sometimes there is ornamentation for the sake of ornamentation and embellishment and aesthetics. So I think this actually goes to the heart of what Ibn Ezra is not only trying to do in his own commentary, but what he is trying to push against, what he's trying to educate against and reject when it comes to the midrashic ethos that really suffused Latin Europe. There's a great comment he makes in Megillat Ruth where there is a very banal phrase about measuring an ephah or something like that. And he talks about, a visitor that he has who says, "What's the meaning here?" And Ibn Ezra basically says, "There is no meaning. There's no extra meaning." And the person walks away and is sad and disappointed and aggrieved, and then comes back and tells Ibn Ezra, no, it's the gematria means this, and its mystical meaning is that, and it forecasts this. And Ibn Ezra just says nothing, and and the person walks away happy and satisfied. So I think that I think Ibn Ezra, it is his poetic sensibilities that lead him to say that the biblical text, it's a work of literature. And that's why we should apply literary conventions to it, and we should interpret it as such.
That's very interesting to me because, of course, one tends to think, at least initially, that if someone is searching for pshat, very, very pshat oriented, very plain text meaning oriented, so that is in conflict or somehow incompatible with this literary sense, or this awareness of the possibility of the Torah just and other books in Tanakh as well, sort of adding literary ornaments for the sake of it, and just embellishing because that's what one does when one writes a piece of literature. It's very interesting to me that Ibn Ezra, precisely because he has this aesthetic sense, precisely because he's aware of the possibilities of ornamentation and poetry and an extra literary flourishing where it wasn't perhaps necessary, but a literary flourish certainly adds to the work itself. That in a way aids his quest for pshat, because that allows him to I suppose drill down to what is essentially the meaning of a particular verse or a particular passage, rather than have to account for every single word and every single letter. That is interesting.
I think it has to do with his deep appreciation of language. So he compares words to bodies and meaning to souls. And what he basically says is that you can say the same thing in multiple different ways. That, you have what's critical is the idea. What's critical is the soul, the meaning, and the words are there for expressive functions, and people are going to express themselves differently. So I think it's not just it's his poetic sensibilities and his just appreciation for language that enables him to really resist these midrashic impulses.
Fascinating. I suppose the final major question I want to ask regards the Pirush, the Ibn Ezra's commentary on the Torah as a whole, because I want to ask just a more general sense you get of it, and for the following reason. There are some Pirushim on the Torah which seems to me stand as major works in and of themselves and as statements of a philosophy of Judaism. So, for example, Ramban. ala Torah is a massive work which includes everything, and includes the mysticism, and includes the philosophy, and includes the literary analysis, and includes the halakha. It encompasses everything. The same with the Abarbanel, a massive work which if you just read the Abarbanel ala Torah, you just read Ramban ala Torah, you'd be very well placed to understand their philosophy as a whole. It's a I wouldn't say maybe a complete statement, but a very broad and multifaceted statement of their understanding of Judaism as such. They use the Pirush Torah as a conduit for expressing this. So my question is, do you think that's the case with Ibn Ezra? Can you read Ibn Ezra's Pirush Torah and get, firstly, a full sense of what he thinks the whole Torah and Jewish everything is about, what Judaism is about, and does it stand as a good representation of the Ibn Ezra, he himself as a person, as a thinker? How complete a structure do you get? It's very difficult to quantify, difficult to answer this question. But just I'm sort of asking for your sense. How large and complete is the structure, as it were?
I don't think so, because, and I think this really goes to who Ibn Ezra was and how he operated. First of all, and some people are critical of Ibn Ezra for that. They'll describe him a little bit, I don't know, disparagingly, but as eclectic, as not systematic, as not all that rigorous, that he's sort of taking these stock ideas and motifs and inserting them into his commentary in a way that's he's not constructing something that is like a self-sufficient mode of thinking. I think that's one way of reading Ibn Ezra. I think the other way of reading Ibn Ezra is that he's really following the biblical text. And because he is wedded to the biblical text and to explicating the Pshat, he can't be systematic. He can't put forward a systematic philosophy or theology. The other thing that I would say is that, and Ari Hughes talks about this in the context of Ibn Ezra's philosophy, is that all of the tensions and the contradictions within Ibn Ezra's work could really be ascribed to that they're inherent, so to speak, in this Neoplatonic, Aristotelian philosophical milieu, which was really his. It doesn't lend itself to any kind of systematic exposition, and that it's not just that it wasn't deliberate. It's that this is who Ibn Ezra was. This is like kind of a characteristic feature of his philosophical tendencies. And I think, there was clearly so much going on for him on a personal level, even on a social, cultural, familial level. There's evidence that he lost children, that his son converted to Islam. I mean, who knows for sure? And he was wandering. I think it stands to reason that somebody like that might have a hard time actually writing a philosophical treatise.
Yes. There are some people whose ideas cannot really be boiled down to a systematic philosophy.
Exactly.
It's too much. It's too eclectic, too heterogeneous, too difficult to put in a box, which is fine. And as a poet and a writer and a thinker, perhaps Ibn Ezra just couldn't put his ideas down like that. Fair enough. And I suppose one final question, which is something I asked to many of my guests, which is as follows: if you could sit down tonight to dinner with Ibn Ezra, and have a conversation with him, what would you be asking him? What topics would you bring up? What would you want to know that you don't know, and you finally had an audience with the man himself? What is the sort of thing you'd be asking?
A great question. Yeah, I mean, there's so much.
Right. Take as much time as you need.
Okay.
You can think about it yourself, because it is. I do actually, funnily enough, like to spring this question on my guests, because I'm just curious. Like, is there a thing that you just killing you and you don't know the answer, and you might never know the answer, but if you had the man just for 5 minutes, you'd be able to get the answer out of him? or just something you'd like to know more about? I don't know. Like, what's your gap
Right,
in Ibn Ezra
right,
studies that you just love to plug?
right.
I would like to know if he was actually any good at chess, because he wrote extensively about it. I don't know. Like, are you proficient at the game, or do you just talk a big talk?
Look,
Whatever.
I don't know how to play chess, so that would not be my question. But my kids do. So, I think that some of my questions are almost less about what Ibn Ezra himself thought and more how would he regard the ways in which his thinking and commentary has been received. I mean, look, I am very curious whether whether he sees Sod as part of Pshat, like which goes back to our earlier conversation, did he actually see Pshat as encompassing Sod, or would he have agreed with me that no, Pshat and Sod are two layers, two exegetical layers? And I would also say that, in his secret of sacrifice, I forget when somebody says that, nobody's actually been able to unpack or decipher that secret. It also seems to have to do with astral magic. So I would love to hear what he has to say about that. But I think more fundamentally, there are ways in which I think Ibn Ezra has been interpreted and understood and used, maybe even exploited. And I would be curious to know what he thinks of that. Which intellectual streams in the Jewish community would he identify himself with? So would he embrace biblical criticism and argue that, yes, you can be an observant Jew with deep attachment to the tradition while still kind of subjecting the biblical text to source criticism? Or would he have said, nope, that's going too far? There are certain places where certain sodot that I find myself